Beautiful. Center target. Hit. Top right corner.
Hit. Middle center plate.
Oh, awesome. There we go. Hit. Center hit. Got him. Hit it. Beautiful. Nearly dead center.
Yeah.
Got it. Hit. Bottom left. Right on edge of target. Hit. Good shot, mate.
Okay, today I want to do a video which I've been prompted to do by numerous communications, by all means, from telephone to Facebook to YouTube. Lots of people asking about adjustable bases. Now, I want to point out some things that I don't think most people are understanding, and some, well, things to consider when you're thinking about putting on an adjustable base. In this very simple basics of it is the engineering life approach of KISS. Keep it simple. Keep it simple, stupid is where I came from, but keep it simple was the comment. And what we're actually talking about there is the more complex you make something, the more likely is for something to go wrong. Now, with an adjustable base, you are essentially doing that. Rather than having something nice and solid, you are having an adjustable mechanism. Now, there are benefits to using an adjustable mechanism when you have reached the limitations of what else you're using. I've done a couple of long shots using the cold shot base. Now, I've been through and explained what I had to do that, and I'll go through that in more detail. But to start off with, I want to point out a couple of things. One is, for my critiquing, for my advice, it doesn't come from the fact that I was born knowing everything. It comes from the fact that I've made mistakes. I've made more than my fair share of mistakes and learnt and developed and modified and basically changed things around, changed myself around to try and make improvements, and always learning from what I get right as well, and even more so what I get wrong. So the likes of the adjustable base, in that case the cold shot base, it did a good thing for me. It made something possible that wasn't possible otherwise. So on that score, it was a great unit. I did modify it. This is the unit I actually used. And I went through, I completely replaced the front pin here, put a lot heavier pin in it and made it a lot more rigid. I also went through and tightened everything through the back here, ran it locked up, basically went through and, well, in the simple form of it, I turned it into something quite hard to use. Everything was locked down, trying to make it as rigid as possible. I still found there were times when I'd go out and I was struggling with things, and I really felt that I'd fixed things, it was all working properly, but I'd find the elevation was actually changing. Sometimes I'd get 3 shots in one place and 3 or 5 shots in another place, just moving around a little bit. And then the fundamentals, then switch the head back on, what's actually happening, and I found I was getting some movement. Even though I'd locked it up so you couldn't turn this was locked up super tight, been re-drilled and pinned, with a big heavy machinist bolt through there, so things had been changed. It was still moving. And the fundamentals of engineering mean that if I have a fulcrum point here, I have a thread that's running down through here, I have an adjustment, I also have quite a thin bar on the top here, and what I'm actually doing is I'm running a scope. That was the attacker, the knife force attacker I was running on there, but all scopes are reasonably heavy and not super light components. And what actually happens when the rifle goes bang, that inertia turns something that, let's say it weighs 3 pounds or 2.5 pounds, that turns the inertia turns that into probably coming up to 20 pounds of force is trying to hang off the top of this little base up here. So in the basics of the engineering of the process is the solider you have things, having no flexibility, having that mounted on solidly is really the only sensible thing to do. And what we're doing is bringing in a compromise to try and get something else out of it, which is the extra adjustment. And I want to go through the fundamentals of where adjustable bases come from. Where they really came from was in the world of yesteryear to a degree, but a fair while ago. They came in for the fact that scopes didn't have much elevation adjustment in them. A lot of old scopes had near to none. They were just zeroed, so that you could get them to on zero, but you couldn't adjust anything. So then you could have a scope and you could get it to shoot long range. You could get elevation out of it by putting on an adjustable base that made that scope move. So then you could get more elevation and shoot long range with a scope that had no external adjustable turrets. The other side of things that came back from in yesteryear more, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen sometimes in this era, but was that scope, the glass quality and the way the lenses were set up and the way the internal lenses and bits and pieces were set up inside them meant that they were far more accurate and far more clear looking straight through. In the zeroed form of your scope is where they were clear to look through, and where you got the best control and the best adjustability, that's where they were nicest to look through. In my experience, well, let's say over the last 20 years or pretty much this century, that's not been the case. They are as clear and as accurate. Any decent scope is as clear, and I shouldn't be touching and talking about a beast. It's obviously a tier 1 scope, but even down in the tier 3 and the lower end scopes, the $500 scopes and $600 scopes, that type of thing, even scopes there, I've found, in my experience at least, to be as clear all the way down as they are in the middle or all the way up. There's not a lot of difference in their clarity side of things. There's not a lot of difference in their adjustability side of things. So they are also, scopes are getting heavier, but they are also got adjustments and bits and pieces on there. So you don't need to simply have a component like this. So like I said, it's a little bit of a component that was built for a long time ago, built for situations that that's being used nowadays to try and help go to another level in the ELR. Same sort of stuff as I used it. So I want to reiterate, and I'll do this a few times, I'm not saying a bad product by any means. I'm saying keep in mind that you may be bringing yourself another problem. And that's what I'm really leading into, is that people don't, how should I put this? One of the things that happens when your rifle isn't shooting as well as it can, so when all of a sudden your half-inch group or your 1/8-inch group or whatever it is group opens up to where it's 1.5 inches or 2 inches, or I shouldn't say inches, I should say MOA, you'll start driving yourself nuts trying to figure out what it is that's going wrong. People go through years of load development to try and make sense of this sort of stuff. In that situation, you bang into any of that sort of thing, even if it's shooting fine now, once you go there, if you've got something that's variable in your system or potentially variable in your system, it's a bad thing to have, because it's something that then gives you a doubt of where everything is, which is where I try and avoid. The next side of things I want to explain. Now let's say you've got a very good adjustable base. There are other ones, there's a cold shot, there's an Ivy. This over here actually is this is the Aerotac, and this is one that I've got on here and I do use, and I think is probably, it's the one that I've gone to where I think it's an acceptable compromise. The reason I use it is that it's a cam system, but you unlock, it actually has big locks on either end, which means you unlock both ends, you move it to your next MOA, you lock it back up, so it becomes a solid bolted thing. Still has an adjustability. There still is potential movement because it could potentially move against those locked up nuts. It's not going to wobble around, but it's the level of compromise that I'm prepared to find acceptable, but I'm not going to deny that it is a level of compromise. But you have different choices. But let's say you've gone for an adjustable base that is unacceptable in the way of its movement. It's not got any of those problems. And that gives you the advantage of that. That gives you more range of scopes. You can fit more scopes. You don't need a scope that has big elevation. This is a Beast, has 120. Most of the Night Forces have, I shouldn't say most, the Attacker and the Beast have the 120. A few of the others have the 100. And then there are reasonable scopes out there that normally have, or some of them have, or are up in the same sort of thing, from the 100 to the, I think it's 150 as far as some of them go. But if you've got some of the other scopes, I'm not going to mention brands, I don't want to pick on anybody, but you've got some of the other scopes that have only got 40 or 50 or 60 minutes of elevation, you may be thinking to yourself, listen, I can fix that by getting myself an adjustable base. That all of a sudden gives me all this extra elevation. So, likes of the cold shot, this is the 300, but even the 150, I've got 150, and I can put on my 60 minutes in my scope. That gives me 210. That's awesome. A huge amount of adjustment. A couple of details I would like to point out. One is, you have to have gone to the effort to get the right rail. So your rail then needs to be custom generally to get around, to get it to you can actually use your full elevation of whatever you're sticking on top. This is a 120 minute scope. Here I have a 60 minute rail. And then I have, these Air Attacks have 70 minutes. So it has 0 and going up in spaces of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 minutes of elevation I can get out of this to give me, with the full 120 on this rifle has 190 minutes elevation. So you've got to make sure you've got your rail to work properly. Just using one of these, nice easy way, I just wind up to it or whatever it is, you're losing from your adjustable base to gain back by having this adjustable thing. So I get the, just understand the compromise is what I should say. But there's another feature that most people aren't thinking about. If you're going to shoot where you're using 100, 150, 200, 250, 300 minutes of elevation, you're going to need lots of windage. So as a rule, and I wouldn't say all the time, but most times, if you've got a scope that's limited in its elevation adjustment, so its internal elevation adjustment is, let's say, only 60, you'll generally find that its windage is probably less than half of that. So 15 to 20 minutes of elevation either direction. That's not going to cut it. Once you go up in elevation, so you're running 150, 180, 200 minutes of elevation, in any even light to moderate wind, you're going to be running up to 30, 35 minutes of windage in one direction. So then all of a sudden you're starting to use a whole heap of holdover going to the side of your screen. You're starting to, essentially what I'm trying to say is that the compromise you've taken on is bigger than you realise. Anyway, I suppose the basic core of what I would say is that, how should I put this? What I'd get back to is adjustable bases. Yes, there is some advantages to them, but they are not all positive. The differences are not all positive. There are some pros and cons to weigh up. I would tend to suggest, and in most of my shooting, that what I've come to in my own head, in working things out with when it comes to a base, is that I try and put the elevation, put as much as I can into the scope and use all the scope. So setting up on the right base and using the right set of rings, so you end up with where you can use your full elevation. As I've said countless times now, with the likes of a 100-minute scope, I'll have generally, the easy way to do it is a 30-minute rail. You can normally get up around 30 minutes in your rail, and then I'll have the likes of a 20-minute set of rings. The mono ring's a nice way to do it. That gives me 50 minutes of scope cant, and in a 100-minute internal elevation scope, I'll get to use those full 100 minutes. If I can do that, then I've got 100 minutes, and then, as once again, I'm generally use a second focal plane scope. You can do it to a degree with the first focal plane, but with a second focal plane scope, I can then wind back. I can generally get up to another 70 odd minutes of holdover. And that's okay, you can see that as a negative, and I understand the logic of that you are then using a smaller picture, so you're zooming back, get a smaller picture, and using your scope for holdover. You'll be surprised how accurate it is. Most of my long shots, not all of them, but shooting to 3,000 yards with a 7mm rem mag, shooting to 3,000 yards with a 300 Win mag, shooting to 3 kilometers with this rifle previously, they were all done using holdover. Now obviously you're shooting further than that, things start to change. There's other things going on, but you'd be surprised how accurate holdover is. The benefit with using holdover, if you've put a decent scope on it, you've got a decent base on it, you're able to use holdover, what you'll find in that scope is you've also got lots of windage adjustment. So if you keep your holdover to where you're largely using the center bar in your reticle, and then using holdover, there's obviously Horus reticles, that's another conversation, and that type of thing. But if you are using just a normal reticle with a straight line down the center and using that for holdover, and you can dial with your wind, so you can put on, as I said, 25, 30, 35 minutes of wind, you can dial onto that, then you have a nice, simple, straightforward way to shoot, and you'll be very surprised how accurate it is. The big plus in my mind, which I've proven a few times now, is that there isn't a variable there. There isn't a grey area of if something's going wrong, it isn't, oh, is the scope base moving, is there something else moving, and your rifle is right back to come back and do its zeros and do everything nice with nothing moving, nothing wriggling. You're not pulling things off and putting back on. And obviously in the theory, you can simply have your base, wind this back down to zero when it's right on, it's all done, and use your scope and all that side of things. And I've no doubt that for 90% of people it works faultlessly most of the time. In my experience, what happens is there's an irregular side of it, and like I said, it's not all positive. It's not as simple as I've got this so I can shoot out here and it's all done. There's other negatives you might be introducing into your rifle. So as said, the KISS approach, keep it simple, less mechanical, adjustable bits and pieces are going to make your combination work better, and it's just something I wanted to point out. Once again, I don't want to take anything away from the qualities of where this cold shot product is used, or there's the Ivy system, which I don't have here, I've never actually touched. Supposedly it's more expensive, supposedly it locks down a little bit better, there's bits and pieces. I'm not going to comment positive or negative because I don't know enough about it. I use this air attack system. I've used it on a couple of rifles, I haven't faulted it. I still want to say there is a potential compromise you're bringing into the rifle, but I feel it's less of a compromise because you have the lockdown points where you can actually solidly clamp it. It's not locking up on a thread or anything, it's clamping one side of the rings to the other side. But in my heart of hearts, the nicest way to do it is with a solid set of rings onto a solid rail and make the scope work properly. If I was advising anyone, I would spend extra money on the scope to get more elevation first, rather than spending money on the likes of set of rings. I understand completely. There's guys who have already got this and they want to use this, so in some cases that compromise. I've been there, I've done that. My honest opinion at this stage is I wouldn't do it again. It did the job. And I should comment on that also. This one here I modified. I did get commented by the guys who actually build these, who said, listen, the early ones had problems, we've modified them, we've made them better, they're a lot better, we can swap one over. You send it back and we'll swap it over. I don't want to swap it over. This is part of my history. This is on the shot, so it'll stay in my, if I never use it again, it's still a thing that helped me do what I wanted to do, and it'll stay in my cupboard accordingly. But my comment is more so that people understand what they're really taking on. It is not a simple thing that wax on is going to do everything right. There is other details involved. So think carefully before you think about the likes of an adjustable base.